Faiz ve riba arasında fark var mıdır?
I would like to thank Allah for giving me this opportunity to be part of this event. And also, I'm thankful to the host of this program for inviting me. And also my salam and greetings to everyone who would be watching now or later on. And I am going to share some thought on a topic that has been suggested to me with a question that what really is the difference between interest and riba? I would like to begin with some prefatory remarks because, first of all, it is a very sensitive topic. And for a lot of people, this is basically a settled matter. And why in the world you would like to talk about it, something that has been settled or resolved for so long period of time? But I would like to point out that hopefully by the time we finish this presentation, that it would be taken as food for thought and as part of our critical thinking exercise. But in this regard, to avoid any misunderstanding, I would like to present a few points to keep in mind. Number one, as Muslims, it is my firm belief that we are supposed to follow the teachings of the Quran and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So whatever I'm saying, it is part of my quest as a Muslim to understand different aspects related to Islam and our life. And in this particular context, the issue of interest and riba. Number two, to Muslims, the issues of halal and haram are very important. So this cannot be taken lightly. Any issue related to haram must be taken seriously. And when it comes to riba, this actually falls into a category of sin about which probably there is the sternest wording from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, where it is mentioned that if you do not give up riba, then basically get ready to have a war with Allah and His Prophet. So this is not something trivial or light matter. It is very important to understand that why in the world Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be so stern in regard to this particular prohibition. Number three is that, to me, my approach to these issues stem from the fact that in the overall framework of Islam, that we are supposed to not just avoid riba, not just avoid pork, not just avoid gambling, but more importantly, there is a higher principle, and that is that we must establish justice and we must avoid or even fight against dhulm, injustice and exploitation. And quite interestingly, in the ayah where this particular thing is mentioned about the sternest punishment, it also says, La tazlimuna wa la tuzlamun, that you must not cause any zulm, not be victim of any zulm. This clear connection between zulm and riba must be understood in the sense that we see the obvious link. And there are many people, many scholars have tried to de-link this. And when you de-link this, that even though that part of the ayah is there, but the way riba would be defined, basically it won't have anything to do with the issue of zulum or no zulum, because it is mechanically defined. Having said that, let us begin with recognizing that there are certain typology of riba. And the two most common typology would be that riba and nasiya, which is basically referring to deferment in any kind of debt or loan. And then the second would be riba al-fadl, which is kind of any kind of excess in case of barter, where you are exchanging commodities and things like that. Now, even though these are the two common typology that is identified, but there is another one which is a subtype of riba nasiya that is called riba al-jahiliya. And often we don't talk about it. Now, what is the difference in this regard? I am going to briefly share these points for your food for thought, and then gradually This presentation is actually based on one of my writings, that is the riba interest equivalence. Is there a consensus? And given the short time frame, I'm going to focus only on this issue. Is there a consensus about how to define riba and the scope of riba and many other things? That probably has to be taken up as a separate or subsequent topic. So now let's get back to riba nasiya, riba al-fadl, and riba al-jahiliya. Now, first of all, let's recognize also that the type of riba that is mentioned in the Quran is often identified as riba nasiya. You borrow money, it is deferred based on certain kind of stipulation in the contract, and that is riba. If you give something voluntarily extra, that is not riba. Only if it is a contractually stipulated in a debt or loan transaction. Riba al-fadl is something that is completely based on hadith. There is nothing identified in the Quran about riba al-fadl. And in this regard, as I said, that there is a subtype of riba nasiya, riba al-jahiliya. Riba al-jahiliya is only at the time of maturity in case of a debt or loan. It is important, at maturity. It is not whether at the beginning of a contract there is something is stipulated, something to be paid extra, but rather the information that we get from Sirah, Tariq, as well as Hadith, is that this is at maturity. Somebody had a loan. At the time of maturity, they could not pay, or they were asked that, do you want to defer? And then basically, if the borrower requests a deferment, then the borrower would be at the mercy of the lender. And how much the principal amount owed would increase. Quran says, these people are crazy. They increase double, quadruple, and so on. Now, people can say, well, Allah just used double, quadruple just as a kind of metaphorical or nothing to be taken specifically. But I don't believe that we should take the words used by Allah in such a way that Allah just used two words, doubled and quadrupled, without any kind of substantive significance in that regard. So keeping that in mind, if we take riba al-jahiliya, then basically it is only at maturity. Much of the discussions that we have in the contemporary world, including the basis on which Islamic banking and finance as a new movement, as a major phenomenon from 20th century has emerged, then there are a lot of things to think about, because then you are limiting the scope of riba only to riba al-jahiliya. Now, riba al-jahiliya, quite interestingly, according to Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, this is the only true riba, okay? Not the other types. Then there is another interesting thing, and that many people may not know, that when we take the two types of riba, riba nasiya, deferment in debt and loan, or riba al-fadl, there were some prominent sahabas who asserted that riba is only in nasiya, not in riba al-fadl. They did not recognize riba al-fadl to be a valid riba. And what kind of sahabas are we talking about? Like Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, also Usama ibn Zayd, Zayd bin Arqam, Bara bin Azib, Urwa ibn Zubair, Abdullah ibn Masud. These are some well-known sahabas whose position is that only in nasiya there is riba, not in al-fadl. So once I started studying riba, these anomalies appeared to me, that the way we make riba blanketly equating with interest, then these runs into problem, because first of all, riba al-fadl does not seem to be covered by the traditional definition of riba. And second of all, I see that there are sahabas who did not recognize riba al-fadl to be valid type of riba. Now, whether somebody agrees with those sahabas who had different of opinion, that's a different matter. Our orthodox position that has evolved is simply based on the broadening of the scope of riba in such a way that yes, both riba and nasiya and riba al-fadl, they are part of the overall scope of riba. Now, then we take it one step further, and that is when it comes to riba al-fadl, assuming that riba definition covers all of it, both riba nasi and riba al-fadl. As it is based on hadith, it is important to note that there are 6 commodities that are identified as ribawi commodities. And according to these hadiths, you can trade on the spot and in equal quantity for these 6 commodities. And those are gold and silver, barley, wheat, date, and salt. These are the 6. Now then it opens up an interesting discussion because according to Imam Dawood, as well as the other Imam of Zahiri Mazhab, they do not believe in qiyas. So for them, it applies only to 6, not 5, not 7, not 60, only 6. And these 6, no other. So riba does not apply to sugar. It can apply to salt. Riba applies to wheat and barley, but it does not apply to rice. So there are others, those who have broadened the scope, that basically riba can apply to almost anything based on qiyas. If you're familiar with qiyas, it is one of the secondary sources of Islamic law and jurisprudence, and it is analogical deduction. You know already something, you apply it to something that is unknown. So the Prophet said 6, so you try to identify what is the underlying reason, and then on the basis of underlying reason, you then extend it to other areas that may not have been identified before. So now you go to different schools of fiqh, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and so on. They broaden this scope, and when they apply it, according to one madhab, this is ribawi. According to another madhab, the same thing is not riba. Now, why are these anomalies? There are a lot of complicated issues that, again, cannot be handled in just one presentation. Those who actually want to study, I am probably one of the most prolific contributors to the topic of riba. And on various aspects related to riba, and both historical aspects and contemporary aspects, I have to invite the readers to take my invitation and explore those writings according to their interest. Now let me come to the point that if we really believe that Islam wants a society and economy to be zulum-free, free of injustice and exploitation, then we run into a problem that what exactly is injustice, what exactly is exploitation. And apparently, suddenly we run into a problem that we might say that it is relative. Different society understand injustice and exploitation differently. Or if we believe that actually injustice and exploitation is something that is universally understood and recognized. And that is why when the Quran says that you must stand for justice. Now, when Islam says that you must stand for justice, it doesn't give any definition. It assumes that we already know and understand. So to me, Islam is actually envisioning a society that would be free of zulum and injustice and exploitation. I would like to start the discourse, or anyone who would like to explore this from that angle first, to understand what is zulm. And let me explain briefly why this might be an important issue. When we talk about riba, and if we take interest as equivalent of riba, there are 2 parties, a lender, a borrower. Now, we can say that there are 4 possible outcomes of this transaction. Let's say party A, lender, party B, borrower. Now, it is possible that in this case, both parties are harmed in the transaction. That, of course, is easily understood that that cannot be an acceptable transaction. It is possible that lender, party A, benefits and the borrower, party B, is harmed in this transaction. If one party gets harmed, again, that's a questionable transaction, and it actually would be considered as zulm and unacceptable. If the lender benefits from it and the borrower, if the lender gets harmed and borrower benefits, that also is a form of zulm. And again, it would be questionable and it would be falling under the category of riba. Now comes the fourth one. If both parties benefit from a transaction, where is the zulm? So if we somehow understand this issue, that you cannot have both parties actually benefit in an economic transaction, and if you define that as a zulm, then it is difficult to explain to people that in what sense. Then we must again go back and define and clarify what really zulm is. And this is one of the reasons, I don't know how many of you are familiar or from the readers or the viewers, from Al-Azhar for a long period of time. They have been giving fatwa since the time of Sheikh Muhammad Abduhu, Rashid Rida, and there's a long silsila of scholars from Azhar tradition, Grand Muftis and so on, Mahmud Shaltut and so on. They have concluded and held that interest, the way it is practiced in modern banking, is not riba. Now, why they take it? Again, I cannot get into the details in the short presentation, but first of all, you cannot say that there is a consensus and Al-Azhar is not part of it. Al-Azhar ulama and fuqaha, they have a different position on it. Now, we may disagree with what position they have. They actually point out quite a few things. And those of you who are interested can read the fatwa issued by Al-Azhar on different occasions. This is something they point out that, first of all, modern banking system was not in practice at that time. So when actually a borrower was borrowing money from a lender, usually there was no regulation, nobody to protect the borrower if the lender wanted to exploit. In modern banking system, and these are all governed under central banks of respective countries, well, a bank cannot charge whatever interest to its clients. It cannot even pay to the depositors whatever rate it wants to pay, because this is regulated. Second thing is that if we look at, based on the fourth typology we talked about, that when both parties benefit, anyone can empirically look at the transactions of banks, that when people borrow money, many of them actually are doing it for business purpose. They have want some capital. They want to start a business with some small loan or something. Well, most of them, according to the empirical studies, they benefit from it. So banks benefit, the borrowers benefit. Also, it is commonly argued that at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, basically the borrowers were poor and the lenders were rich. So of course, poor borrowers were vulnerable to the exploitation by the rich. And these are kind of loan sharks and who are trying to just make unjust enrichment of their wealth without contributing anything to the economy and so on. Now, in modern times, there are many borrowers who are richer than the lenders, because you're talking about billionaires borrowing money and, syndicated loans and many other things, where overall borrowers are not necessarily poor and vulnerable to exploitation, especially under a regulated environment. So just like there are arguments that are given that why interest is riba and riba is haram, so interest is haram, there is an orthodoxy, a pretty entrenched orthodoxy that promotes this explanation. But there is also a minority view, at least a minority view, that does not agree with this orthodox viewpoint, and they have certain issues that anyone who is interested in understanding riba, because it is a serious matter. One of the things that is also pointed out, that riba is actually not something of a trivial transaction. It's not that somebody borrows at 1% and nothing bad happens to any of the parties. It is not like that. The examples that we learn from hadith and history and seerah is that you get into riba, your life is ruined. There have been cases where people have sold themselves to slavery because they just could not pay. The 100 dinar they have borrowed, at the next maturity, it became 200, 400. And soon it went out of control and they just could not deal with it. And they basically surrendered themselves as slaves. So a lot of things have changed in modern times. Now, do this matter? Those are things that, as Muslims who take Quran and the teaching of the Prophet seriously, those who take that haram must be taken seriously, and if it is of the sternest warning, then we also have to understand that this is something very serious, where people's life gets ruined, people's life gets upside down. They are exploited to the fullest, and they don't have any recourse. We actually have another point to make. If we really care about exploitation, dhulm, according to some of the studies, more exploitation takes place based on simply profit-oriented commercial enterprise, where the issue of interest is not involved. So normally or traditionally we say profit is halal, riba or interest is not. But if dhulm occurs, that also is from profit-oriented enterprise without any connection with riba, then we are somehow delinking our understanding of the contemporary world in light of the way we mechanically define interest and its link with riba. For me, both as a Muslim, as a human being, I want to see a zulm-free world. And in this world, definitely riba must not have any place. Now, the way we understand it now, it really does not even scratch the surface of injustice and exploitation that exists in contemporary time. And to me, that is delinking the same ayah that is teaching us to give up riba, but also its connection with dhulm, la tadlimuna wa la tudlamun. But the way we understand in traditional orthodox way, it amounts to delinking the two parts of the same verse. So if we work for a dhulm-free world, we also need to work for making it riba-free. But if we just seek a riba-free world in a very narrow sense, the way it is defined in terms of interest, then we might have a riba-free world, but not necessarily a dhulm-free world. So my approach to understanding this is making the issue of dhulm as the starting point, and then try to understand that what exactly is so serious to Allah and His Prophet that He has issued this kind of a stern warning. Any kind of trivialization of riba basically does not match the stern warning given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, I present this again as food for thought. So I could be wrong. And if I am wrong, I have to stand in front of Allah and hopefully I will be forgiven. But we all have to decide for ourselves. You study as Muslim on this issue, you draw your own conclusion, but hopefully with an open mind and with a clear vision that we want to stand against dhulm in any way possible, and we want to get rid of dhulm from our economy and society.